mics on here, so
Hey.
Yeah. So, all right, everybody, welcome to Creekwood UMC Bible Study Live Wednesday nights. We're so glad that you are joining along with us again, as always. As you join on, comment that you're here so we know who we're talking to. And if you are somebody watching this after it was live, we want to welcome you too. And you can always comment along as you're watching, because it will come to us and we'll be able to respond back later in the week with anything that's going on. So we are happy to have everyone joining with us tonight. And currently no one's with us right now, but they'll hop on now that they see that it's going to come to fruition. So
Laura Howard's on.
Here we go.
Laura Howard?
Yeah.
I think it just takes a little bit to update on our StreamYard thing here. We got 4 people now.
I watch us.
You've got multiple devices going on.
I'm very vain. I see myself right now.
You're the person that taught me that I could hide myself on Zoom. So to say that you're vain, yeah.
Okay, this needs to be told to the whole 5 people on in this current moment, and as we get more. So on Zoom, you can hide yourself in the grid view. There's a little option on your little window. You can click. There's 3 dots. You can click it, and there's an option that says hide self view. And I have found that it makes my Zoom calls less exhausting because I'm not checking my hair every 10 seconds. We're like worried about what I look like, or worried about, do I look like I'm listening? Because if I'm worried about looking like I'm listening, I'm not listening anymore, actually. And it just says, I found Zoom to be way less exhausting with this hide self view feature. I don't know what the right word is for it, but it is life-changing this time.
Yeah, I totally agree. I stopped just like staring and be like, my eyebrows really are bushy, and actually focused on what people are saying. All right. So hi, Laura. Hi, Jenny, I believe is here as well. So Keri Lynn, why don't you introduce Shandon to us?
Yeah. So this is Shandon Klein. I got it right. You have to point the wrong way on this. So I met Shandon. So we've had a couple of my friends on Shandon the last couple of weeks, which has been fun and also embarrassing. So Shandon's a new friend. And Shandon and I met, oh my gosh, it was June of last year. Because I don't think we met at school. So June of last year, we both came to the laity session of annual conference. And so laity are people who are not clergy, who are not ordained pastors. So at Creekwood, that's everybody but David. And now everybody but David and me and Katrina. So Shandon and I met at the laity session because we were both running for the delegation to general and jurisdictional conferences, which is the basic governing body of the United Methodist Church. That came straight from polity class.
Nice.
Yeah, well, Bishop Whitfield shouts out. He taught me everything I know. So Shandon and I meet, and we're running to be on the delegation. So it's like, at first, like you're competing, but it was so cool. And I think Shandon agrees with this because we meet, and there were more young adults that ran from the laity session, I think, than ever had run before from North Texas.
Oh, yeah.
And in the laity session, we get to give speeches. You get like 2 minutes to describe why in the world you want to be on the delegation. Really, because like why? We're on it, but why? And so it was so cool because there were none of the young adults who were there had really ever met before. We all knew like we were connected, but every single young adult in their speech included, before they got there, hey, if you don't vote for me, please uplift more young voices. Please vote in at least one of the young people that have run. And so it was so cool. And I think Shandon pointed this out. Like when we gave speeches in there, like the Holy Spirit just came alive in this room in a way that I've not felt in a lot of other places. And so Shandon and I are 2 of the young adults that got elected to the delegation, which is so fun. So Shandon will be serving that. I will take a different role now that my status has changed. But Shandon
ruin that.
I mean,
Thanks,
Yeah.
COVID.
right?
Because it would have been fine if there hadn't been a pandemic. But
Yeah.
so Shannon will continue to serve in that capacity. And she and I really got to, we really just became friends so quickly. But in February, we got to travel to Oklahoma City together. And that was a wonderful thing. Just car rides with people help you really get to know them. And Shannon got to meet my parents and stay at my mom's house because we didn't want to pay for a hotel in Oklahoma City. So shouts out to Carol.
Yes. Great host.
Awesome. Yeah, she had snacks.
Had snacks. It was a great.
My mom's the most. I love it. But Shannon,
mother like daughter.
Yeah. So Shannon is just. I was telling y'all. I was hyping you up a few weeks ago, and she's gonna cringe when I say this, but Shannon's a prophet. Shannon, I am learning so much from her in this season, and I'm just watching Shannon get so brave and speak so boldly about things in this world and things in our church that need adjustment or total fixing. And I've watched her just be brave in some really scary moments to some really powerful people. And so Shannon, I am just honored to even be in the presence of, much less call you a friend. And she's not even done with seminary. Y'all aren't even ready. But Shannon works at First United Methodist Church of Richardson. She currently serves as this is a cool job title, Fellowship One Specialist, I believe.
Nice.
Right. And they're going to be moving Shannon. She's going to enter into, so at Perkins at the seminary, your third year is an internship with the church, which means the church has you do everything, which is great. So Shannon's going to enter into a jack of all trades role here pretty soon at First Richardson. Shannon, is there anything I'm missing or anything you want to add to tell them? Oh, she's married to her husband's awesome. Yeah.
Yep. I'm married to my awesome husband. And we've been together for 19 years. Wow. And it's we just got married, 3 years ago, babe? Yeah. It was, we've been together forever. We got a Great Dane, a Rottie, and a cat. And the cat rules all of them.
I was going to say, that's a combination there. Yeah.
Yeah. But outside of that, I'm in my last year of seminary. I got through my credo. Praise Jesus. And credo is basically doing this very large paper on everything that you believe about God. And it's very stressful.
Justifying it all. Yeah.
And then applying all of that kind of stuff. And so excited to get into that last year, but very anxious as well because all this is completely unknown to me. And this is my first time ever doing a Bible study. So y'all just be really nice to me. And look at my cousin. My cousin's on. Ricky Collins is my cousin who is a pastor out in North Carolina. So
wow.
Welcome, Ricky.
Hello, Ricky. That's exciting.
Family here for your first time doing Bible study. This is perfect.
Yeah. And of course, it's going to be in front of you, Ricky, really.
Well, Shannon, we're really glad you're jumping on with us today, and I'm pretty sure that you're going to shine for your first Bible study. It'll be like the Major League Baseball player that gets out and hits a home run on their first at-bat ever in their career, which has happened 11 times. So you're going to be you'll number 12 here. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. There's just a lot of different stories in this. There's a lot of stories in everything because as we've talked about, Mark is action-packed and everything is condensed. And we're probably somewhere around in year 2 to 2.5 of Jesus's ministry. Mark doesn't give a whole lot of timestamps like some of the other more detailed gospels do. And so just again, as an overview, everything in Mark is important because it's short, it's fast, it's Sports Center highlights of all the stories, but everything in there is incredibly important and can tell us a lot about what Jesus is trying to do. Mark is the first gospel, the earliest gospel written, or at least the earliest gospel that we have that has accepted into the canon that is written down for us. It was the basis for Matthew and Luke, and really is an important, I would say, important document as we get to hear kind of the earliest accounts of what people thought was important about Jesus. So it's been, I don't know, I know that the first week I wasn't here, Shandon. It was Keri, Lynn, and our student pastor Katrina, what is it, pastor of family ministries now, Katrina, and her friend Maggie Proshek. And I watched it later, and all three of them threw me under the bus because they're like, we really don't like the Gospel of Mark that much, and David picked this, and so I am hoping that we've redeemed the Gospel of Mark here over the last week. So anyway, all right. So the way we do this for anybody who's new is we kind of just read along, and then we take pauses along the way and have some questions and some thoughts that we will that I'll kind of serve as the MC or host tonight, and Keri, Lynn, and Shannon are going to be the experts. And then you who are commenting along, we would love for you to join in the expertise giving as well. So any questions, comments you have, whether you're watching this live or later, please chat along with us, because this is meant to be done in community, and the Bible is meant to be read in community. So anyway, let me start. So we're going to do 1 through 10, because we've got another mass feeding event going on. So let me read this for us, and then we'll chime in. It says, in those days when there was again a great crowd without anything to eat, he called his disciples and said to them, I have compassion for the crowd, because they have been with me now for 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, and some of them have come from a great distance. His disciples replied, how can one feed these people with bread here in the desert? He asked them, how many loaves do you have? They said, 7. Then he ordered the crowd to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves, and after giving thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to distribute, and they distributed them to the crowd. They had also a few small fish, and after blessing them, he ordered that these too should be distributed. They ate and were filled, and they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. Now there were about 4,000 people, and he sent them away. And immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmanthua. I have no idea if I said that last part right, but and we're going to go with my theory on, if you don't know how to say it with confidence, and everybody else will assume you're correct in how to say this. So another mass feeding event. This follows the feeding of the 5,000, and the interesting thing that jumped out to me when I first read this and looking it over is that, like, they've already fed 5,000 people, and they've already had like the walking on water, and they've already had all this stuff, and the disciples still don't get this. And so this is a great question for modern day. It's also a great question just for the disciples in Mark, is like, what do you perceive as the getting in their way of understanding? Like, what gets in a person's way of understanding Jesus to y'all?
Go, Keri, Lynn, go. I'm like, I got an idea, but I want to hear from you first.
So what's twofold. I think that here, what I'm seeing with the disciples in the text is, and we're going to see this kind of start to happen, is they're looking at the things that Jesus can do and asking themselves how it benefits them. In this kind of, and Mark 8, and this chapter is kind of crazy town, but I really do think it's the turning point of the gospel. I think this is where we start to see some major events happening after this. There's kind of a first half and a second half of Mark. And so in this first half, we see Jesus performing these miracles and performing these healings, and we're learning that the healing can happen at a distance, and we're learning it can happen with just a touch of the cloak, and we're learning it can happen digging around in the dirt and spitting on things. And the disciples are bringing people to him, and they're going out, and they've been given authority, like they've already done the thing. But I think what we're going to see here in a second, like with Peter later, is and there's the question, I think, in a couple chapters about who's going to sit by you. The disciples are asking themselves, what's in this for me? How am I being filled by this Jesus guy? And I would then say that, inversely, what I think gets in the way of understanding Jesus for us today is the same question. Is we're asking ourselves, what's in this for me? What do I get from this? I'm not being fed from this. I'm not being fed from this. I don't get anything from, I'm not fed by traditional music. I'm not fed by contemporary music. Jesus loves contemporary and traditional music, and probably would yell at you for caring, like, right. Or at least this version of Jesus. And I think that's kind of how I saw this, is what it is for the disciples is what it is for us. Just it's easier to laugh at them.
I agree with that. Like, I think the thing that's missing is that compassion. So, down in where it says, I have compassion for the crowd because they've been with me for 3 days. If y'all remember back to when they were with the Jews, with people who were just like them, it took one day, like a night, for them to recognize, hey, Jesus, we need to send them out so they can go back and get to feed all of them. Now we're around the Gentiles now. And, all this crowd's walking with you. They're with you. You have 7 things of bread, and you've done it before. And really. But yeah, what's interesting, one of the things that I like to kind of compare this to is so we have the feeding before, and then right before the feeding in chapter 6, they had the feast with Herod. So they like to compare those two things. So we have Herod, which, even though really feared John the Baptist, when said like, hey, I'll give you everything. Well, oh my gosh, they're asking that the daughter says that, oh, give me the John the Baptist's head on a platter. Well, I can't look bad in front of my people. So I guess the person that I fear and that I actually listened to and got advice from, I guess I'm going to have to do it anyway, and actually uses John's head as, bread, kind of. So then that's contrasted with, chapter 6, feed by 5,000 in compassion. And back then in chapter 6, he has this compassion in his heart, right? And it actually says, like, you know what, you go feed them, trying to give the disciples an out, being like, hey, you've been able to do these things. You go feed them. Still didn't get it. Now that they've done it, here's where it's so funny in the Greek with in those days there was, again, like the Palin, it's out there, like, again, just in case you don't know that this happened before, again, we're going to do this. But it's so interesting that Jesus literally turns around to the disciples and says, I have compassion on the crowd that has been here for 3 days. If I send them out, then they will faint and probably die. So what are we going to do? And they still have the same not having compassion, right? So and they have more, they have the more things. I think that to me, that answer, like Keri, Lynn said, is not having compassion on anyone else other than themselves. And it's kind of sad.
Which I think does ramp up in the next couple chapters, especially after the transfiguration, and Steve's answering here, the big I, pride, desire, and all these things telling us that we should be more than just a blessing to the people around us. So which I just want to add in, like, one of the things that I had not done in a long time before we started doing this whole COVID Bible study online was like just read through the Bible verse by verse. Like, I was always finding things for scripture or little parts that I wanted to study. And so, like, reading a whole thing, and especially getting to the Gospels now, like, I've really, like, it's really cliche to say, but like, fallen in love with Jesus again. Like, Jesus is awesome. And what I find really fascinating is when both of y'all are saying, here's these disciples who are both clueless, not having compassion. They, Mark goes out of his way to make them look bad in multiple circumstances, and yet they're still sent out before all of this to do God's work. And I think it ought to, hopefully that says something to somebody more than just me about, if y'all haven't encountered already, you'll encounter so many people who will tell you, I just don't think I'm ready for this, or I don't think I'm equipped for this, or and we can all raise our hands for all of that. But to know that, like, God sends out these selfish, non-compassionate people to do God's work, even though we're not perfect, is pretty amazing.
And appeared to them after resurrection. Like, they were still the one. Like, Jesus didn't show up running down the street in Jerusalem. Like, it was still these goobers that got to see him first. which means that like you goobers watching this can be used and can be sent out. And absolutely, that message of grace is. And Jesus continues in ministry with them after this incident, right? Like, and he gets a little frustrated here in a second, which, like, can you blame him? Like, have you ever hung around teenagers? And, I just, yeah.
All the teenagers watching just left.
Sorry.
No,
No, but isn't it so cool that this is not where the gospel ends?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think that honestly, because I mean, you like with Mark, it starts out like this is the gospel of, Jesus Christ. I'm like, this is the gospel that Jesus calls sinners. He said, that's the reason why I'm here. Back in chapter 2, he let us know, like, hey, I'm not here to call the people who are already righteous. I'm here to call the sinners. And we see, yeah, they're sinners. They keep that all the way till the end, till they peace out. But it does give you that sense of hope and just being like, well, shoot. Jesus trusts like these sinners and maybe calling me to be able to follow him and take up that cross, which we'll probably talk about in a little bit.
Yeah. Good. So one of the other things that intrigues me about this, besides just the mass feeding event, which is always fascinating to read, but this one, I think, I don't remember in the feeding of the 5,000, but this one very explicitly, like Jesus pauses and takes the bread and blesses it, and then takes the fish and blesses it. And it's not like he does a magic trick and waves his wand, but he like gives it to God, which, we do when we celebrate Eucharist. We give these elements to God. We do it in baptism, all the sacraments. We're saying we're giving this water, we're giving these elements, we're asking God to do something with that. And so like either this story versus the other story or in this story, what's the significance to you? What does it mean to ask God to bless something in this context?
So like quite honestly, it kind of takes me back to Genesis, where it's just like, we're blessed to be a blessing, right? It's just kind of like when you bless something, like you bless something to bless other people, and then you bless the world with it. And I feel like that's kind of what Jesus is doing in these feedings. And I'm like, think about it, if Jesus is the bread of life, like, being able to bless that bread and giving it to other people to be able to ingest that and, go and have that sustenance to be able to move on, especially when they're about to be faint, right? Like they have gone around for 3 days and they're satisfied by this bread, and it's kind of has this dichotomy of that. So I'm like, it kind of brings me back to why, I mean, it's one of our main calls as the people of God is to bless others, to be a blessing. And so it's kind of like him following through with that, I think.
Yeah.
So this reminded me of your question. When I was in high school, my pastor actually, for each of us, when we turned 16 and we got a car, he had a script written out to bless our car. And that was kind of the first thing that you did when you got your car. We were very bored in Odessa. When you got your car, you took it to the pastor to get blessed, man. You went to Stars on the way. It's fine.
I just learned what Stars was today, by the way. I don't know if you know what this is. So
it's a cheaper, better Sonic.
Okay.
It's a whole thing. Anyways, so Pastor Terry would bless our car, and I've always been and I think about the ways in which, since I would have turned 6, done.
Nope.
Oh, you're back.
I disappeared a little bit.
Well, am I back? Hello?
Yes, you're back now.
Anyways, that's fun. So my sister just tried to call me and everything freaked out. Shouts out to Allie. Anyway, so I've been thinking about my car has been used for ministry a lot in the last few years. When I was in college, I led a girls' small group my last 2 years. And so I had freshman girls, most of which didn't have a car on campus. And so I tried each semester with all the girls in my small group I would take them out for like a one-on-one, like coffee or lunch or whatever, like once a semester. And then if somebody needed more, like more often, you know, and my car was the way off campus for freshmen. Or even like, and this is not like, it is what it is, but like, you know, when we've done youth ministry events, and not at Creekwood, but at my last church, and there were kids who needed a ride home, right? Like my car is used for ministry in that moment. And even now, like I think about like, what does it mean that my car, and it's not even the same car anymore, but like to look at my car and bless it, and to use it, like Shandon said, like to be a blessing. And Ricky is commenting houses. You know, I know a lot of pastors, when they're building houses, they go in and write things on the drywall. Or when we're building houses with like Habitat or mission work or whatever, you know, what it means to pray and ask for ministry to happen in a house, and for good things to come about because of a car. I've just thought a lot about like, what does it mean? What would it look like if we blessed things more often, as weird as that sounds? Like, why do we do a blessing of the backpacks every year? Well,
right, yeah.
We want kids to experience the love of God at school, and we want them to show the love of God to everyone else at school. And by having a very formal, very funny, very awesome blessing of the backpacks before, that is cultivated, and that starts from the very, very beginning. I've been thinking about that, about this question, and shouts out to Pastor Terry for blessing my car when I was 16.
Yeah, so I hadn't been thinking about blessing of the backpacks for whatever reason, even though it's coming up. But you know, when we do that, I was like, I've made kids cry with this before, but like I always ask kids to unzip their backpack and open them up wide, so that like, and we're gonna pray our prayers, and we're gonna ask God to bless inside this bag. And then when you get to school, and then we try and zip them up real fast, and then when we get to school, we're just gonna unzip the backpack, and all of God's blessings are gonna go over our classroom, so that we're gonna know God is with us, and we can work through our tests and all this. And the reason people have cried has been like they couldn't get their backpack zipped fast, and they thought everything was going to get out. And so yay for kids who take everything literally. The
sweet things.
But thinking about that, you know, like what is a blessing? A blessing is asking God to use this, and so turning it into a vehicle for transformation, or turning it into a vehicle for blessing. And if we did think of our houses that way, and the food that we put at our table that way, and you know, meaning very intentionally putting those things for God to use, because I think it's a little bit like the differentiation between the United Way and the church. And the United Way could have gone out to, or a million different things could have gone out to the field, seen 4,000 people who are hungry and given them food. Jesus is the one who gives them food that transforms them with compassion. And I think, I don't know, I can speak for myself, that once you have been given a blessing of compassion, it's very hard not to share that afterward, because of the humility you feel. So one thing I will note on the interesting of the feeding thing is, I did read a short note that this parallels, like, they're two different stories told in slightly different ways with slightly different numbers. And one commentator suggested that they parallel the Exodus and Numbers retelling of the Exodus when they were fed in the wilderness, and turning this into an example of where God is moving the Israelite people toward liberation. So giving them the food that they need so they don't rest anymore. Because in Numbers, they're like expressing, if only we had meat, right? In Egypt, we had meat. And as much as I love any good brisket, they're being set free from the things they thought filled them up, and being liberated to what really does fill us up.
Yeah. Oh, another little fun note. So I remember looking at a commentary at one point on the fish. So they actually were comparing of like when they were I guess the little fish were kind of like a delicacy. So they'd put it on bread, kind of like, think of like caviar type of thing. So this feast that they're giving isn't just something to like kind of like get them along. Like it's this like very like almost royal feast. It's very like they compare that, and so it's kind of that direct comparison of doing the bread and the fish, like the bread and the fish thing together when put them together, and it's very similar to what Herod would have served when he was serving his at his festival that he had. So
that's interesting.
Like,
I've never.
that was pretty neat.
Yeah, no, that's cool. I mean, one and every feast story that Jesus tells is one of like decadence and abundance.
Yeah.
And you know, we talk about even on the Sundays during Lent where we don't have to fast because in the kingdom of God, you know, everything is abundant. So welcome back, Keri Lynn. We're glad that.
Hey. Wait, I'm like this way now. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we're doing whiplash. Shannon gets to be in the middle now.
I have no idea what's happening. It was like it was there, but then there was no audio, and so I'm watching you two, and I can't hear it, and I'm like, I'm sure it's really good stuff. So that was really, I'm like sweating now. That was really stressful. Sorry. So sorry, everyone. This is real life.
Shannon solved the Omega code. So,
hated when that happens.
Yeah.
Sorry.
All right. I'm going to move on to verses 11 through 13 here, which is a little shorter. I will make a short side note is that I loosely looked at a map earlier, and Jesus in these stories kind of ping pongs back and forth across the Sea of Galilee to like the Decapolis and then to this side and then back over to the whatever Dalmanutha and all this. So Jesus really needs a better travel agent than one of the disciples or wherever that maybe the Spirit's calling him in different places. He could have been a lot more efficient. Let's just put it that way. So, all right, verse 11 through 13. And this is kind of all these are going to connect together here. They all kind of have a theme that go along that we'll uncover as we go along, but it's this demand for a sign. So it says the Pharisees came and began to argue with him. It's nothing new, asking him for a sign from heaven to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, "Why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly, I tell you, no sign will be given to this generation." And he left them, and getting into the boat again, he went across to the other side. So first of all, for all those who think Jesus is like eternally patient, we've got the parental like, why do I have to answer this for the 17th time? Impression of Jesus. And so he's gonna he always kind of talks about on that day. And so in my impression of what Jesus talks about, even in the Beatitudes, we talk about these are promises of what the kingdom is going to look like. The meek are going to inherit the earth. The voiceless will be given a voice. The injustice will be made right, and those people will be lifted up. So there are, and then you can get into some of the more like apocalyptic things where it's like the sky will turn red, and those on that day one will be left in bed and one will not. And I don't think that those are rapture references, by the way. I can make a good argument later if you want, but so Jesus is prone to showing signs, like the feeding of the 5,000 and 4,000 are actually signs of the coming kingdom of the abundance. And so why is it that when the Pharisees ask, right? Because I think Shannon made a good point. Like he's talking to the Gentiles now, like he's given food to the Gentiles. Why, when the Pharisees come and ask for a sign, why does he deny that to them?
See, like what's interesting, I'm like, I don't think he's denying them. Like, I think that he, I think he just recognizes that they just don't get the signs that are already there. You know, like, I think that and honestly, you know, like it kind of reminds me of Exodus. You remember, like back in Exodus, they're just like, oh, and what if we just need like a sign? Like they've done like God's already done so much for them. Like and
bread fell from the sky,
literally from the sky. Like, and they literally like picked it up, and in Hebrew, it's like they called it, "What is it?" Like that's what they called it. Like it's called, "What is it?" And but like but I think, you know, because he's kind of sighing, he's like, why does this generation always ask for a sign? I think that there's also like, you think about these Pharisees. So these Pharisees are supposed to know everything, right? Mm-hmm. You know, like they're the ones who are supposed to know it all. And they're just like, well, if you're this, then give us a sign. Like, because they're already supposed to know whether that this is a real thing. And if they're looking for the Messiah, it's not going to look like the Messiah that they really think it is, you know, like, so they've been given all these signs. I think that Jesus is just kind of just seriously, she was like, honestly, to this generation, no sign's going to be given because they're not accepting the sign that's there, you know, like, so you can kind of go back to chapter 4 where they're talking about the different soil, right? Like the good soil is the one that takes the word and accepts it. So they're like, so these Pharisees they're hearing the word, but they're not accepting it. And so I'm like, there's signs there, but you have to accept the signs that are given to you. It's not going to be like, Santa God, give me what I want, right, and I'm gonna give it to you. It's like, no, I'm not gonna do that. Like, I run this thing. So I'm like, I guess he's just kind of whatever.
So I'm gonna have an in-depth theological question following up from that after Keri Lynn goes on that brings something we need to chat about.
So anyways, I'll just delay and keep us from that. No, I'm kidding. No, I wrote down this question because the question that David had was, why does Jesus deny a sign? And I just wrote, or does he? Like,
right.
Because my thoughts are on similar, like, and again, like, this is the beauty of reading the gospel all the way through, is because you read this, like, outside of reading 8 whole chapters of plenty of signs, and you're like, okay, well, Jesus, can you not be a jerk? Like, bro. And then you look at this and you're like, oh my God, like, bread is falling from the sky. Like, people are walking around for 3 days without food and making it. Like, that was a miracle. And I think just, and again, it's the Pharisees, and it just, God bless them, you know. Jesus is just not the Messiah that they were expecting, and I don't know what sign they want is the question, right? Are they wanting to Jesus to pull out a sword and behead a bunch of Gentiles? Is that the sign you really want right now? Like, and is that who you want God to send? Like, really? That's who you're gonna go with?
Right.
I could do a whole thing about. I was thinking it'd be really funny if I did my whole spiel about Waitress the musical, because we've been doing musicals the last like 8 weeks, Shandon. But I'm saving it for when I do another musical sermon series. But she says in the beginning, she says, someone send me a sign, and the sign ends up being not what she wants. But then over the course of the musical, the sign that she sent ends up being the thing that she ends up just totally like changing her life in a good way around. And so I was thinking about that, like, what sign do you want? Like, what do you really want? What are the implications of the Messiah that the Pharisees are asking for? Because it's not a Messiah we would be following, I bet, if it was the one that they wanted. Does that set up your theological question?
Yeah, no, it does, and I would just kind of confirm that they enter with a spirit of arguing as opposed to and testing. Whereas you look at the wilderness story in Matthew, where Jesus quotes you should not put the Lord your God to the test. Like, you don't approach a sign saying, "Hey, test me." Although I remember we did this study at Creekwood called The Circle Maker, and it was this Jewish story. Mark Batterson is this Jewish story where a guy goes out and draws a circle and says, "I'm not leaving this circle until you make it rain." And sure enough, he stays there long enough. It's all about persistence and prayer. So that does lead in, and everything leads in. So that speaks to me of how we've talked about calling and how we've talked about faith as a personal story. That we have a personal relationship with Jesus, we have a personal testimony, and faith is something that I hold personally dear. Have we created too much of a Santa God in the personal thing by not letting God be a corporate God? Like, and so I guess the question is Shannon's already there. Question is, do we receive personal callings, or is God a community corporate God that we kind of need to fall in line with?
Yeah, I think I'll probably know what my answer is going to be on that one. I think that we've lost that that sense of God being that corporate God. Just like at the end of the day, it's not about like me or you. It's about all of us together, right? And I think that it's dangerous for us to be like, okay, like, what is God going to do for me? Like but because the thing is that we miss the blessing in being able to be that beloved community, and to be able to share and like be blessed to be a blessing. We can't be blessed if we aren't going to bless other people. You know, like, so it's just like, I think that I guess that's kind of where I'm like, I love the term Santa God. I'm like, oh, yep, heard that. And I'm going to use that all the time. And it's, I'm like, it doesn't mean that you don't ask for things from God, right? Like, I mean, but I think that it's important that when we ask God about things, like, think about your intention. Who is this going to bless? Is it only going to bless you? You know, and why are you asking if it's only going to bless you? You know, like,
right.
I can share the love. You know,
Wow.
yeah.
I'm thinking about in your question, David. So we do have individual callings within the corporate, right? Within the body of Christ, there are arms and legs and ears, and some people are the armpits. I'd stand by that theologically.
Armpits
Kids are watching.
Armpits are still useful.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Yeah,
it's just, they are what they are. But the disciples, again, back to what we were talking about at the beginning, where the disciples start to get it wrong, right here in this turning point of chapter 8 is where they lose that corporate focus.
Yes.
Right? They're focused on the community. They're focused on bringing people. There's literally a group of people who lower a guy into a house through the roof so he can get healing. And that's not something you see after the turning point of chapter 8. The problems start when the question is, what's in it for me? And that's where we're like, again, like, I really want to go back and ask the Pharisees, like, what sign did you want? Like, other than everything else that he had been doing, like, what were you asking for? Because was it for you? Like, was the sign you wanted Jesus to say, hey, Pharisees, you guys got it right? Because if that's what you're asking of God, yikes.
Right.
Like, I mean, it really hit me a couple years ago. I don't remember really the details of the situation, and if I did, it wouldn't be appropriate to share on the internet anyways, but I was just really mad at someone. This is great. This is
Thank you for being a healthy individual.
I'm just learning a lot about, like, vulnerability in this whole space of online Bible study, but still filter. Anyway, so I was just really frustrated with something. I don't remember what it was. Roommate problems. I don't remember something. And I'm like railing against this person in my mind, like, they're awful, whatever. I don't even remember. In hindsight, apparently wasn't that big of a deal. But what popped in my brain, what immediately, like, pinged me was, yes, but they've been given just as much grace as you have. And they are loved just as much as you have been. And that is truly, like, we sing Amazing Grace, and it's about how cool it is that we get it because we're so messed up and yada, yada, yada. The person who in November is going to vote for the person that you don't like has been given the same amazing grace. Does that make sense, what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And I've gone off a wild handle now. So let's look at what Ricky said.
Ricky's asking the question too. He's bringing up the question again. Have we set it up, right? Because that's where I would argue is, as theology has taken this very personal turn, that the more personal it becomes, the more it becomes only about my experience versus the corporate beloved community, as Shannon put it, and not recognizing that we're called to be blessings to each other and all that. So I and
that doesn't mean agreeing theologically, right? Like, the corporate community is not my pastor said it, so that's the truth. Because that's not what we want either. I'm assuming that's not what we want.
As long as you agree with me, I agree with that. So,
but that's not, because I think too, there's sometimes the overcorrection to the corporate community where there is no individual thinking.
Right.
But what does it mean to live in this corporate community together that has the same amount of amazing grace, that same amount of saving love, and can still disagree on what color the carpet needs to be in the sanctuary or whatever?
So, like, one of the things I tell people, and I'm going to try and do this briefly, and ask you this briefly, but one of the things I tell people when they say I've never heard God speak to me or I've never heard God's voice is I'll generally, like, hand them the Bible and say, well, here you go. There's a lot of wisdom in here, on top of the wisdom we've received from our elders in the past and the people who our ancestors, and the wisdom that's been passed down from divine spirit throughout the church and throughout our mentors and parents and all. So I think a lot more people have heard God speak than would give them, would give themselves credit for.
Yeah.
How would you say, so people watching, maybe people who have always lived into that, and I hear a bunch of people like, I felt a very clear call to be a pastor. I know that was something in my baptism that God set out. So how do we tell the people who are lawyers and teachers and work at Chick-fil-A and other places who may not see that as divine work or blessed work? How do we tell them? Well, Chick-fil-A obviously is Jesus' favorite restaurant, but
Lord.
Sorry, you gave me a slow one down the middle.
I know. So I guess, what would you say? So I hear people who say, I just don't know what God's calling me to do. What would you say to them if they're looking for God's calling and waiting for like this telephone call, kind of Santa God? How would you tell them to look for God's calling?
I wouldn't tell them to look. I'd tell them to listen.
Okay.
So I'm like, I speak from experience, I'm like, especially from like, so this is me going from like, so this is a second career for me. And like, it was definitely, I mean, looking back, like I kind of, in the vocation that I chose, and I wanted to be a pediatric heart surgeon. So yeah, this is a complete, thing on that. And I thought I was looking at it like, this is how I am going to serve God, not listening to be like, hey, God, what do you want me to do? And I think that it's a weird thing. Like, I mean, I know the first time where I had just been like, you know what, I'm just going to listen for God. Like, I was in a very tough space between jobs and all of that. And I just, like, it was one of those things. But I literally was at my wit's end. And it got me, like, I had to be at the bottom to be like, okay, maybe like what I've been thinking isn't working. Maybe I should be listening instead of praying, and not making it a two-way street, like a conversation like prayer is supposed to be. So it's kind of one of those things of just like, it's like praying to God. And like, for me, it's, those very reoccurring thoughts that kind of go through your head of like, honestly, like it's very affirming, it's very loving, and I'm like, I know that that's not me in my head to myself. Like, it's that conscience, like I think that God speaks to us through our conscience. I think that God speaks to us through the people who are around us of being like, oh my gosh, you have a gift for this, like it's just, it can come in so many different places. It can come through a text. It can come through a devotional that's sent to you. Like it can come in through so many different ways. I think that people are listening for this really huge, big voice to come from God, or like, I don't know, high voice to come from God. I don't, like it could come, hey.
Could be feminine.
Could be feminine. Like, and a whole bunch of mad faces that took by. But anyway,
no way.
But
better not.
But I think that like to your point, Keri Lynn, I think that the voice that we think we're wanting to hear from God, we might be looking for a certain thing. Like you were saying with the Pharisee, like, what sign are you looking for?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you shouldn't be looking for one. It should be just receiving, right? Like that's the good soil. We receive the word when we hear it, and that's listening. So yeah. I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah, I think 100% agree with everything you're saying, Shandon. I think that when there is a question from somebody who is working in a corporate position and they say, well, I don't know what to do. I don't know. I try to remind people, one, we're all called to ministry. it's not just me and David. It's not just Shandon. It's not just our staff. Every single person, when you join into membership, that's part of the vows, is taking part in the ministry of Jesus through the Holy Spirit to show God's love to all people. And so for our job is to help you all in your call to ministry, right? That's a lot of how I see my job, is setting up the opportunities for everyone, for lawyers and accountants and AAA workers and Cane's workers, if they're not at God's favorite chicken place, to live their call to ministry in ways that works for them, in ways that God has gifted them, and in ways that they feel loved, and in ways that they're challenged as well. And I think this is where I would maybe put on my little challenging side. And if I did have a lawyer sitting in front of me saying, well, I don't really know what God's calling me to do, I would look at them and I'd say, okay, what if it's something that's scary? What if it's something, I have a friend who I was in seminary with who left a 6-figure job, who was making 6 figures a year doing human resources, and is now an elder in the United Methodist Church. And I'll tell you right now, if you don't know what God's calling you to do and you're about to get asked, be careful, because if it's something like, are you willing to do?
It's never easy.
If it's upping your tithe, if it's chairing a committee, if it's taking on doing something really scary, if you've never sung in front of somebody and your gift is singing and we need to put you in the praise band, like that's my other question is, are you asking I don't know what God's wanting me to do? Or are you asking, I don't know what God's wanting me to do that would be within my comfort zone? Because also the answer could be the sign of feeding 4,000 for the second time could be right in front of you. But if we're accidentally having this Pharisee mentality and they're like, well, that's not the sign that I wanted. Bro, that was your sign. Like, sorry, okay. Jesus is moving on to the next thing. And there's grace, and that sounds really harsh, but that's kind of what I would put in front of you all. I mean, we all had to face that in our call to ministry, right? I never had the booming masculine or feminine voice coming from God. My call to ministry has been cultivated in community, and I heard the voice of God through people. Through people who loved me, and people who supported me, and people who genuinely cared for me holistically. And so also know that is within the realm of what I would also encourage somebody who is asking me that question. So a little bit of tough love in there, sorry, but
no, it's good. And I can definitely say I heard the feminine voice, because it was 2 associate pastors, both were female, who took me aside and was like, you need to become a pastor right now.
So right now,
at this very moment. I didn't listen, but I should have. I'm going to add one more thing before we move on, because my wife had a really good point. Lindsay had a really good point on here about maybe if we have a more diverse body of pastors leading churches, that people will see that they can do it. And I think about, like, Siri just popped on my screen for some reason. Siri's wanting to join Bible study. Siri.
Hey.
Now I'm saying the name, it keeps popping up. Yeah.
Come on,
Siri. So I even think so. A church member recently texted me and said, my son came back from working at this camp and saw Keri Lynn up there and was like, oh, we have a female. How can females be pastors? And he grew up at another church I used to be at, that the service I inherited was started by a female pastor. So he's seen this, but because it hasn't been a preponderance, right? It's still a question of, and my own daughter at one point has said, can girls be pastors? And I'm like, please, yes, more of those. So I do think that the more we have kind of a different variety of person leading, lends itself to, oh, I don't have to look like that or sound like that. The voice can be different. And I think the more we also talk about calling in a lay perspective, will also help that out. So we change the narrative. Instead of getting up there and sharing these wonderful call stories to ministry like the disciples have, we share stories about the people who didn't follow Jesus, but they stayed behind and they were a butcher and did the very best they could in their community. So I think that would be like a great change for church leadership to do, is to emphasize calling is not geared toward just being an elder or deacon, or a lay minister, and then it could, or a licensed pastor. It could be anybody. So
calling does not have to be vocation.
Yeah,
it does not. Like, they do not have to match at all.
All right, so I'm gonna try and keep us on pace here. We're at verse 14, and the only thing I can label this as is Keri Lynn's favorite way to refer to Jesus in Mark is jerky Jesus, because
direct communicator Jesus.
Direct communicator
is the nicer
Jesus
term that won't get me fired, but Jesus is totally a jerk in the Gospel of Mark.
It's just that Jesus, Jesus has already basically given the hand palm, palm in the face with the Pharisees. So we're about to see it again. All right, verse 14 says, now the disciples had forgotten to bring any bread after they just had this huge amount, and they had only one loaf with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, watch out, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod. They said to one another, it is because we have no bread. And becoming aware of it, Jesus said to them, why are you still talking about having no bread? Do you still not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear? And do you not remember? This is like the most disappointed parent.
I know, it makes me laugh.
I was laughing in my office reading this yesterday. It makes me laugh.
Yeah. All right, let's see. Verse 19. When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? They said to him, 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? And they said to him, 7. Then he said to them, do you not yet understand?
And it's like,
I mean,
I'm sorry, like, that's the best, like, parental, like,
right
conversation right there. How many did I give you?
Right.
Oh,
let's do the math.
It's just like, this is one of those moments where, like, one day I'm gonna translate the Bible, but it's gonna be like a Keri Lynn version, and like instead of this whole metaphor, Jesus is just gonna go, bro. Like, that's all he's gonna say. Like, are you kidding me?
So
it cracks me up every time. I'm so sorry that I started a laughing fit, but
it's fine. It deserves it. Every bit of that is just funny. Like, every bit of that is just funny from the standpoint of Jesus there. And so I want to take this. So obviously, like, the disciples have just been showered in bread recently. They've been doing bread snow angels on the ground because there's so many crumbs left over. Like, they've already been through this, and they still just have no conception of, like, that Jesus is going to provide, or that they're with Jesus, or they have no conception of what Jesus is talking about. And what I started thinking about in this is, like, the feeding of the 4,000 is this big mountaintop experience in the lives in this journey, right? It's the big miracle. It's the big sign. It's something that we probably should get charged up about. But then we lose those real fast. Like, we kind of expect every moment to be like that. And so how does this story for the disciples, how does it relate to, like, the mountaintops? And I think it goes back to calling too. Like, we have, even as clergy, we get called to clergy. And I'll tell you that 11 years into this, sometimes it's draining. When I'm not really, I mean, sorry to just bust the bubble, but
there's literally a pandemic. Like, are you kidding me?
I mean, I don't know why I'm drained or exhausted by any of this, but so I guess, like, if you give the disciples advice for how to live into this, how to carry the mountaintop experience over, like, what does everyday faith look like? Because the Pharisees are looking for, we need you to feed 4,000 people every day. Like, we need you to do something every moment of every day, or else we're out. And the disciples are like, we need to see this all the time, or else we just don't understand. All the people who are watching, all of us, don't see that every day. We are surrounded by a pandemic. We are surrounded by bad news. We've got people protesting. We've got unjust systems. I mean, it's not great all the time. So where in this story, I guess, what would you tell the disciples about the need for, whether it's disciplining your faith, or how can we let the mountaintop experiences shape the rest of the mundane experiences?
Don't forget the bread that you had. You know what I mean? Like, just, it's like, you know what I mean with the, like, so they're given, like, so they've got like 7 buckets of this bread, right? And they just forget about it. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
they didn't bring it with them. Like they could have brought it with them. They probably could have sustained them. Like,
Right.
but I'm like, if you like, so I mean, there's also sensory overload, right? There's like, do you really want to have that happen to you every day?
Right. Yeah.
You want to have those? I'm like, I don't think you do, because that is extremely draining, right?
Yeah.
It's a lot.
Very,
and even
very
Jesus
draining.
goes away to pray after every time.
Right. Like, even Jesus is just like, I need a timeout. Jesus needs a timeout. I know that I will need a timeout. But even still, it's just like, with also too of like trying to keep finding the blessings in the mundane, right? Like, I would be like, hey, there's blessing in the small things too. Don't miss out on the tiny things, because hey, those mustard seeds. Those mustard seeds be really tiny, but when they grow up, they get real big and they can do a lot of things. But I'm like, I think if it were me, I'd be like, hey, you might want to look out for those mustard seeds along the way too, even if you do forget the 7 bushels of bread that you just got on a trip.
That somehow you left behind. Yeah.
Somehow
Listen,
you left all of it behind.
That's how you know it wasn't King's Hawaiian, because they wouldn't have forgotten that.
They wouldn't have forgotten that. No.
Good bread. It's good bread.
No, Shandon, I think to add to what you're saying, so I've been thinking about this a lot lately, actually, in our current, because some of my, there are videos I see, and there are pastors who've been pastoring for 50-something years, and they're like, I've been pastoring for 50 years, and this is the hardest year in ministry ever. And I'm in like my first year of being commissioned, and I'm like, cool. So you're saying it gets better? Jesus, I hope so. Like, is everything supposed to be this hard all the time? Because so far I don't like it. I'm out. So I've been thinking a lot about this because the question is, like, how do you still be excited about a first year? Like, even like commissioning's coming up in September, and I'm just like not even excited anymore. I'm like, just have it done, And it's an important holy thing that I'm a punk about right now. But I've been thinking a lot about what we do when we're not feeling it. And what if you're waiting for church to be good for you to be feeling it, or for you to hop on, or for you to show up in person, or whatever your choice is, if you're waiting to feel it, like, well, I'll hop on when I'm feeling it, you're never going to hop on, right?
Right.
I think the difference between the mountaintop and the mundane is what we feel. But our control and feelings are real, and we should lean into what we feel. If it's grief, great. If it's sadness, awesome. If it's happiness, great. Do your thing. However, we are in control of our actions. And I think that there are things, and again, like, there are times that I don't feel it. I'm not feeling it, but I still continue to do. There are things I push myself to do. And it's the things that kind of don't require a lot of feeling. So it's singing. When the hymns are playing on Sunday mornings, even when we were in there with nobody, I still found myself singing along to them. Even though there was nobody there to, like, David sings along, but like, that was it.
Very poorly, I will add.
It was like weird little duet moments that, or we're like running around like a broadcast studio, but like I think there are just things to push ourselves in the mundane, in the sad, in the cloud of grief, that we have to do when we're not feeling it. And I think these are the moments that we find ourselves surprised by what's happening, right? The days that I hear that people say that they just didn't want to get up and go to church that morning are the sermons that are the most impactful, that they remember 5 years later. The days that you really didn't want to get up, you didn't really care to read any section of your Bible today, but you did, and it was a section that, it didn't fix everything, but maybe you read a psalm of lament that made you feel, oh my gosh, there's somebody who wrote a part of the Bible that feels like I do. And I think that there's just something to continuing an action when we're not feeling it.
Mhm.
That's very good for our psychology and for our bodies to have consistent activities,
Right.
some kind of schedule. And I think that some type of spiritual, and just one thing, don't try to like pray and have a scripture and a devotion and a video and a sermon. Like, that's too much, right? Pick one thing that you're going to do even when you're not feeling it.
And I would call that faith. Like, faith is not, when everything's great, it really doesn't require a whole lot, right? You go and you're excited and it's energetic. I would call it faith. Is I'm willing to do this because I believe it to be true. And I think what Laura and Steve are saying here is kind of along the same lines as I experience, is they're kind of anchor events to show you that, at one point things were good. Like at one point I did feel a real experience. Like I've got a friend who questions God, and but he's had several very real experiences, and so those are kind of anchor experiences for him to say, even when I'm not feeling it, something was true at one point, and so that means it could be true again, or can be true now, even though things aren't great. But so the next question I want to ask, and I think this is going to get fun, is well, I hope it gets fun, to be honest with you, because our Bible studies always get fun. At one point or another.
It's been fun up to this point.
It's been fun up to this point. I think we always hit a point like that just somebody gets nervous about saying something. We say, hey, go for it anyway. And then we just roll from there. But so what I've experienced in ministry and life in general, I think is, when we enter into periods of depression or grief or anxiety or those not great mountaintop experiences, there's the temptation to do whatever works or whatever feels good in the moment, as opposed to the long run. And Jesus is saying the feast of Herod or the feast of the Pharisees or something. So, I don't remember Jesus saying this before when I read this. I think it's fascinating. So I want to know what you guys think, or you women think. I shouldn't say guys there. You women think, about
y'all works. Yeah.
What is Jesus saying is the bread of Herod or the Pharisees, whether in that moment or modern day? I would love to hear your take on this.
So my translation has it phrased as the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod, which I'm only correcting because goes with my. I'm only doing it because it goes with my answer, and I'm really sorry.
No. So you can woman-splain things. It's fine. I won't be too offended.
I have it so good in my job. I'm telling you. And I would say this if we weren't live on the internet with all of your fans watching. So yeast is the ingredient in bread that makes it rise, that makes bread rise, and it makes it rise, and it grows exponentially in a fairly quick amount of time. So yeast, without yeast, your bread is going to be small, but with yeast, and with even too much yeast, it grows, it expands, it goes fast, it becomes something way other than what it started out as, right? And Lindsay Lessner, you've been baking bread more than I have lately, so chime in if I'm totally getting this wrong. She made me a sourdough loaf. I ate the whole thing like in 2 days. It was awesome. So I've been thinking about this. What did it mean to call the yeast of Herod, the yeast of the Pharisees, the inciting ingredient that makes something grow way, way, way fast? And I'm going to answer on a modern context, and we're just going to go there. I think that in the way Jesus is describing the yeast of Herod and the yeast of Pharisees are this symbol of evil. In their time, what was evil? What is inerrant evil? What is this giving in to forces of evil and forces of wickedness that are there? Not necessarily like evil people, but people who are making choices that are tending towards evil instead of tending towards good. And the yeast of that is the ingredient that's going to make the events and the hatred towards Jesus rise way too quickly and dangerously for him, right? And again, all good for us eventually, but also this yeast causes them to kill a guy at the end of this. And I've been thinking a lot about what is yeast that causes things to grow that shouldn't grow. And in our world, I think about like the yeast of hate that whether it is sexism or racism or homophobia or xenophobia that is so pervasive. Like I just named those four isms and obias, and you already have people in your mind, right? But the yeast, the inciting ingredient, and all of these things that we've watched over time, there are times where racism grows rampant. There are times in which sexism has grown rampant. There are times in which homophobia has grown rampant. There are times in which xenophobia has grown too fast. But the yeast in all of these is hatred, right? And it's just ways in which we're taught to fear people. And we're taught from a young age. And sometimes it's intentionally taught and sometimes it's implicitly taught. But we've seen, I think, and again, like Shandon's done a great job, particularly on the internet, of really speaking things into such a graceful and beautiful way in this. But we've become more aware of the ways in which we have watched the yeast of hatred grow the bread of racism in a way that should not be the case in 2020. I was talking to my mom on the phone the other day, and I've said this like every week on Bible study, but August 18th, I'm going to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote on a federal level. I turned 25 this year. My right to vote is only 75 years older than I am, and that's ridiculous. And so, but the yeast of fear and hatred has caused the rise of sexism to grow. I still get asked if it's allowed that can be a pastor because I'm a girl. It's plenty allowed. It has been in the United Methodist Church for 50 years. But it's still a question. And that question's never out of hate, but it's out of this learned behavior of who can and cannot. I'm on a super soapbox. So Shannon, would you like to chime in with something? I can keep going.
She's like, you want me to step up on my
no, join me on the box.
Join you on the box. Yeah.
Maybe ask the question so we could be on the box.
Absolutely.
Yeah, mine's kind of similar. I kind of looked at it as like, what are the things that kind of filled them or fed them to make them tick, like them, help them to grow. And the main thing that I saw between the two of them when I was, like looking back at, Herod's story and like Pharisees, I'm like, it's status. Because like with status, it's like obviously that was the main thing that both of them were interested in. He cut the head off of John because he was just like, I don't want anybody to think that I don't have power. Like with Pharisees, they had to get rid of Jesus because they didn't want anybody to think that they didn't have power. You know what I mean? Like it's a lot of the things that have to do with, racism or sexism and all of that. It has to do with status. They like somebody's got to be higher than the other person. And back, like if you're connecting that to what they dealt with back then, it's the same thing as idolatry, which is one of the big things that God talks about in the Hebrew Bible. So,
if not the biggest one.
Like the biggest one. And of course, as we remember, idolatry doesn't have to be a big old stick or a big statue, which sometimes it is. Hello, statues. But with the idolatry could be status, it can be money, it can be any of those things. Anything that you put above God is going to be an idol. And I think that they put their own status, their own selfhood above God. And that I think that's what they're asking to be aware of, because we start seeing it with Peter, right? Just in a few sentences later, we're like, hey, Jesus, like you said that you were the Messiah, but this don't sound like Messiah stuff, like, yeah. And it kind of just like, as the story goes on, like you start seeing that those yeasts of status, kind of being eaten and start to rise a little bit. And I think it's why at the end, everybody pieced out. They're like, I'm not a part of that. So
you think that, would y'all say that's the hardest thing about being a follower of Jesus, or hardest thing about being a Christian is the humbling of oneself? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Because I think there's this, because it's hard, and I'm not going to equate this to all women, but I think that females grow up with a really rough relationship with self-esteem. And so I think sometimes it's hard to separate a healthy self-esteem because humility there's this overcorrection, right? I think humility is, the way I heard it described to me was thinking about having a view of yourself that is like accurate. Because I think sometimes we think we're being humble when we're like, oh, I'm just a dumb, ugly idiot. And it's like, well, that's not true. Like, that's not humility either, because you're not. So I think that's where, I mean, for myself and what I've seen working with women a lot in the past is a lot of the female experience. And again, it's just not just women. I'm just adding a lot of the feminine experience is rooted in a really rough definition of humility that I don't think is Jesus's definition of humility. Because Jesus was humble, but the dude flipped tables when the time came. And that doesn't mean he wasn't humble when he was doing that. They wasn't walking around flipping tables everywhere he went either.
Well, I think your humility is supposed to come from your reverence for God and not in submission to someone else.
Yeah,
and I think that's the
better.
difference. I was even typing on this week's sermon today, and I was talking about, how pride leads to these different things. But then I'm thinking about, like, I have been blessed and now surrounded by my wife and 2 daughters and several female colleagues at work, and heard and seen
literally all but 2 at work.
Literally all but no, there's a few more, but not much more. And just kind of heard and seen firsthand, I think for over the last probably, I would say 6 to 7 years, of the natural systems of self-esteem loss that females experience in our culture. And so when I started talking about how pride was this evil thing, I had to think back and like, no, we're trying to teach our 11-year-old to take pride in herself, and to really claim it. She's brilliant and she's beautiful and she's got all of these redeeming qualities about her. So it was interesting. And she is. I mean, she's amazing. So it was really interesting to have to think about, like, okay, so not all pride is bad, but if it's pride associated with belittling someone else to be better, that's where our humility has to come in reverence to Jesus, as opposed to in reverence to some other person. And in that,
I hope that my statement wasn't like gendered in a way that just was negative. Like, we all experience self-esteem, and I think even for men, it's just not on even the forefront of conversation, unfortunately. But I do think that's a thing that I've struggled with as a Christian, is how do I exhibit humility in a way that's not self-deprecating, because all I've been taught is that humility is self-deprecation, and that's not the case.
Well, one of the best things that's ever been told to me was someone, when I got off stage preaching and was at the back, and someone said, why do you always tell bad jokes about yourself? Because I have a very self-deprecating sense of humor. And they're like, we all think you're great, and we all think you're smart, and we all think you're funny, and not everybody, but but like all the stories have me as the butt of the joke. And I was always taught you never make yourself the hero. And I told them that, and then they said, yeah, but it doesn't mean you have to be the butt of the joke either. And so and so like I was kind of buying into, I was using humility as a way of almost building myself up. Like, I'm going to be the most humble person because I'm going to make myself the butt of the joke, as opposed to getting in that mixed zone of, so like I'm taking the yeast of Herod of saying like, okay, well, I'm going to be so great because I'm making fun of myself and do it this way. And this person kind of called me to task and said, like, no, I mean, you're God's beloved person and we think you're great. So stop making fun of yourself and just own the fact that you're good, and, or at least that they, appreciated it, and go from there. So, thank you for that. I love what both of you had to say about status and evil. And I think that we're seeing, I think it does rise. Like, this is, someone asked a question on Facebook, like, how did we get here? Thinking that there's some easy answer. I'm like, no, I mean, it's been building for everything has 18 threads that run through 3,000 years, through all, or even more time. So All right, we're running out of time here, so let me get to verse 22 through 26. It says, they came to Bethsaida. Some people brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had put saliva on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Can you see anything?" And the man looked up and said, "I can see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he looked intently, and his sight was restored. And he saw everything clearly. Then he sent him away to his home, saying, "Do not even go into the village." So we've got another healed guy. I don't know if we need to spend too much time on this, although I think I heard Shannon get excited about this story.
Yes.
So I want to hear what you have to say.
Yay. What are the questions? Like, why does Jesus have to do it twice? So up to this point, we've seen immediately this happened. Immediately this happened. Immediately this happened. This is the first time where there's actually a process.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? So there's going to be some times where God does things right away, but there's going to be times I'll be a witness that God is going to use a process, and you might see it a little bit on the way, but at the end you see very clearly of what happened, but you needed that process to get all the way through. And I'm so I love that whoever the author of Mark was, don't know, not Mark, but the author of Mark actually has those juxtaposed, especially how long Mark got to something to where it's hey, this is something where it was more of a process of healing versus just right away. And makes us think, I know that a lot of people are well, this is kind of showing the humanity of Jesus, which is, I can also, maybe, I don't know, but and so some people are well, it's well, he couldn't quite do it, all the way, so it's just, it's the humanity piece that kind of got that. Well, hey, you could throw that in there too. It's humanity and divine, both of them together. But I think that process of healing can be just as important as the blessings that are immediate. And maybe kind of goes along with your question before of what do you do when it's not that mountaintop experience, right?
You're seeing people that look like trees.
I mean, hey, I didn't see everything before. I'm glad that I can actually see trees walking around. Hey, praise God. I'm well, I think I see people, and that person, and he, that blind man probably would have been grateful for the news. But hey, went the step further and be hey, you see clearly now. That's probably why he went to go and on to all the other places and be y'all, I need y'all to know about all what just happened to me. I saw some stuff.
But Jesus would have left it, and it could have been the first conspiracy theory of the guys there are walking trees everywhere.
But you notice what's also interesting here is that person where you notice that the blind man's response was the same response that the people who had the immediate change had too. It's the same, if not more. He was just you went to tell everybody. So it's, I think there's something really special in that, and showing that hey, your blessing doesn't have to be immediate for you to be grateful and to be able to share that good news, regardless of how it got there, how long it took.
I want that to be a new answer. When people ask how are you doing, and they if they're only getting half their miracle or whatever, they'd be I'm just in one of those seeing people as trees seasons. I'm gonna start saying that the next time
seeing trees.
I'm seeing trees,
the next time I gather with clergy, I'll be people look like trees, but that's fine.
I love that. I actually, I'm stealing that one, Carolyn.
Very good.
So, and just for anyone, I'm going to move us along, but for anyone who's watching who's wondering why Jesus is spitting on people, one of the things I learned about this was that saliva was thought to be a salve for blindness in Greek by Greek physicians at the time. So they're thinking that Jesus is using kind of the wisdom of the day and saying, I'm better than those people, or my way is better. So That's the only
terrible COVID advice.
Yes.
Don't go around spitting on people. Don't do it.
But Jesus did it, and we should right?
Not what Jesus would do. Not what Jesus would do in this situation. Don't spit on people.
Do not spit on people.
That's gross.
Even if they're seeing trees.
Even if they're seeing trees, no spitting on people. You are not a llama.
So when I prepared for this, for some reason, I thought that Mark ended at verse 30, and I missed an entire 40 or 10 verses here. So I'm gonna just read through the rest because we're supposed to be at 6 minutes. So verse 27. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, who do people say that I am? And they answered him, John the Baptist, and others, Elijah, and still others, one of the prophets. He asked them, but who do you say that I am? And Peter answered him, you are the Messiah. And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Then he began to teach them about that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering, and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke Jesus. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, if you want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. So we're ending on a happy note for all those kids who are still watching before bedtime. The Son of Man is going to be ashamed of people here. So this is a little bit of a parallel to that John the Baptist Herod story, where Herod's trying to figure out who John the Baptist is, and they're like, well, we think he's Elijah, or we think he's this part, and Peter comes back and kind of gives the definitive turning point, and you're like, okay, we recognize you're the Messiah through all of this, but then obviously we know this isn't a turning point for the disciples because of Peter immediately rejects Jesus. So it has a lot of just everything we've been talking about, of keeping your mind on human things instead of divine things. So because I didn't actually read this earlier and didn't prepare any questions associated with it, give your final, if we're going to do final thoughts here on all of this. First question is, what do you make of the people have a lot of guilt over the whoever is ashamed of me, I will be ashamed of them. And it's a lot of fear of, I've heard people so far as say, I've never really told anyone my faith story, and I just feel like Jesus is going to be ashamed of me because I didn't share this as often as I could have. There's a lot of guilt wrapped up in there. And so, for the people watching, what would you say about that statement for people that would help them? We're grace-based, so how would you help them see the grace in that statement?
I think it's the same as earlier in the inverse way. The question, I'm not getting the sign from Jesus that I want. I'm not getting the sign from God that I want. I'm not telling my story the way that God wants me to. Are you sure? Are you sure you haven't?
Oh, that's good.
Are you sure just by living your life and being a kind person and not being a jerk to people, letting the person in front of you at the grocery store or paying for the Starbucks behind you, yeah, you didn't sit somebody down and draw roads and sins over here and God's over. Yeah, you didn't do that. But again, very flipped from earlier.
That's good.
What are you really doing? What are you really doing? What are you really asking for? Because I couldn't tell you the last time I sat down and told somebody my faith story. Nobody cares.
It's usually associated with email forwards and Facebook forwards of if you're ashamed to forward this, then you must be ashamed of the gospel.
And guess what? I'm not. But at the same
time,
things.
Human things.
It's the same thing of this Jesus, what Jesus was promised to be for the disciples was not what they expect. And I think that what Jesus expects of us, and I think we would be ashamed of Jesus if we weren't kind people, if we didn't try. I think everything is too hard right now. Like, I think Jesus sees you're trying, and it's fine that you haven't told anybody your faith story. And it's fine that you have questions about, like, why did Jesus have to die? And why are some Christians so awful? Like, it's fine. Like, there is so much grace in everything that Jesus, again, like, these goofball disciples that really screwed it up here are the guys that Jesus, after coming back from the dead, were the first people he wanted to hang out with. Are you kidding me? Like, so I'm like super soapboxy now, but no, you have not caused anyone to shame at all.
Yeah, I agree. I'm like, you're right. It's kind of, everybody expects witness to look in a certain way. And that's the thing. I think that when you live out your faith, like, you know, with what, like, when you live out what you believe, that is a witness, you know, like that, like there is going to be that, like, for example, like if you live out your faith, you are likely going to have people be like, something changed, like what happened, you know, like why are you all of a sudden so nice, or, you know, like why are you not a jerk, Shannon? You know, like, you know, like, or be like, or I want some of that hope that you have, like where does that hope come from? And like, you, like, it doesn't mean that you have to go like knock door to door and be like, do you know Jesus? You know, which a lot of people like think of it like, you know, that is what witness is. That is a form of witness. It's like, but you need to find a witness that's authentic to who you are and who God created you to be, you know? I think that that's really important. And I mean, I think that all of us will spend the rest of our lives trying to figure out what that is, but praise God for having the grace to be there to wait and see us through as we see here throughout Mark.
Well, I think it's interesting. You know, he's calling the crowd with his disciples, and he's telling the whole crowd this after they've experienced these things, and it's the people he's been, I don't want to say ashamed, but like the people he's been ashamed of throughout this whole chapter are the Pharisees and Peter and the people who are trying to put themselves in greater situations of power. So it's almost like those who are ashamed of me are the people who are trying to gain power over me. Right. And so it's not that we're doing, like, I think we hear this and we think, okay, if I didn't press send on the email forward to 10 of my friends, I'm embarrassed to share that I love Jesus or that I'm not American enough or whatever the forward might be. And we tend to think of it in that way because it's been taught that way. Versus really in this chapter, it's those people who are ashamed of me are not willing to humble themselves before me. They're Peter telling, well, Jesus, you're obviously wrong about this. Like, you know, you happen to be the Messiah, but I'm going to tell you what I think. So I think that it's almost if I were to read that again, I would look to the people who are trying to gain power over Jesus as the ones that he's ashamed of, because they're leading people into places where they can't find bread, and they're starving, and they're anxious in boats. And I mean, that's where what's been kind of fun at Creekwood is the biggest growth population we've had are people who are finding their way back to church. And they had, like, it's really great because they've had this, well, I hate that they had the experience that drove them away. And so we're getting people who consistently are hungry on boats because they've been taught to fear and they think Jesus is ashamed of them. And they have found a really overwhelming presence of grace in our people of like, no, we've got hundreds of baskets left over. Because
and we brought them.
And we brought them. Like, yeah, we remember. So I think, and that's where I'm proud of our church is I think we've done a good job of reframing, like, okay, Jesus isn't ashamed of you because you happened to mess up one time. Jesus is slapping his head when you're asking him to perform a sign after he's already done all of this kind of stuff. So, all right.
That's why everybody is called to ministry. Just
absolutely.
Priesthood of all believers.
Priesthood of all believers. Absolutely.
Sorry.
Well, so if we didn't accomplish anything else tonight, at least Nancy Greer will never look at a tree with the same perspective ever again.
But Nancy, if trees are walking around like people, 911.
Yeah, let the paramedics spit on you, not Keri Lynn. Yeah, we can lick your eyes. So we're at an hour and a half. We didn't cover everything here at the end, but I think we did pretty good. So I want to thank Shannon. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been super fun to have you with us, and for everybody commenting along. Thank you so much, Ricky. Thanks for chiming in from NC.
Hi, Terry's also my cousin too. Terry just.
Oh, there we go.
My cousin.
Mom, I missed it earlier.
My mama was up there too.
She was up there. Okay.
I was like, my mama was up there too.
Nice.
Hi, mama.
See, one of these times when, like, because everybody's family keeps jumping on when we're doing this, I really feel like we need to save the first 5 minutes for family to type in their stories in the comments. To do that.
I'm good with that.
Again, everybody, thanks for joining with us again. This was a blessing to me. Shannon, thank you for joining on with us again. It was great to be here for the first time. And we'll be back next week. Next week is my friend David Briggs is
another David.
Yeah.
It's great. It's wonderful that we have so many friends, but man, you could have. They're all named David.
They're all David, yeah. So this guy, David's out in Lufkin, so he's going to join us. He's Abundant Life Fellowship, I think, is the church he's at. So anyway, all right, we're going to sign off, everybody. Thank you for being with us, and have a wonderful night.
Bye.
Good night.